We are in Genesis chapter 17 this evening. We had dropped off on Wednesday at verse 9. So that is where we will begin this evening. Now you'll recall that the first part of this chapter is when God gave Abram a new name. He is now Abraham. And God had restated his covenant with him. Well, the last part of chapter 17, God talks about the sign of the covenant. Now, a lot of times we think of the Abrahamic covenant as just being one thing. Now, this first part that was reiterated in the early part of chapter 17 tells us that this covenant is an eternal covenant, and it doesn't just apply to Abraham, it applies to all of Abraham's descendants, and that it is an eternal covenant. Now, the fact that that's an eternal covenant, and then what we're going to see in the part we're about to read, God institutes the covenant of circumcision as a sign of a covenant, tells us this isn't the same covenant that we're talking about. There isn't just one covenant with Abraham. And the reason we can know that this is talking about a separate covenant is the first part, we're told, was an eternal covenant that would never depart from Abraham and his descendants, which, by the way, includes us because, again, the Apostle Paul said that we are the spiritual descendants of Abraham. But now this second part, we know that the Apostle Paul also said that circumcision no longer applies to those who are who are no longer under the law. So either we are still bound by that, or we're talking about two different covenants. I think what we see here is God established more than one covenant with Abraham. So now, verse 9. It's God said further to Abraham, "Now as for you, you shall keep my covenant, you and your descendants after you, throughout their generations." Now you'll notice it says you, your descendants throughout their generations, but it does not indicate this as an eternal covenant. It just says it does apply to your descendants, but doesn't use the word eternal here. Verse 10 says, "This is my covenant which you shall keep between me and you and your descendants after you. Every male among you shall be circumcised, and you shall be circumcised in the flesh of your foreskin, and it shall be the sign of the covenant between me and you." Now, at first it would seem that God is saying that this particular physical rite is the covenant, but then he clarifies it and says, no, this is the sign of the covenant. So the question we have to ask is, since that we know, according to the Apostle Paul, no longer applies, but yet the Apostle Paul said that all those who are of Christ are spiritual descendants of Abraham, well then, clearly we're talking about something different here. But the question is, if we're no longer talking about this eternal covenant that applies this blessing and this obligation of God to bless us, which applies eternally, since the covenant of circumcision no longer applies, what are we talking about here? What has changed, or what has God moved on to talk about something different?
Isn't that part?
New covenant.
Well, but by definition, if it's a new covenant, then can't be talking about this because that's a new covenant. Something different. Remember what God told Abraham, that it would be through him that the world would be blessed, and God had promised Abraham something which at this point has not yet been realized, which was what?
An heir.
Well, kind of both. An heir. Abraham, other than Ishmael, does not yet have an heir. That's what this is leading to. Because Abraham has already made the mistake, if you will, of trying to figure out how God was going to honor that covenant. And at Sarai's request, he takes Hagar as a wife, has Ishmael, but God, as we will see as we continue in this, makes it clear that's not what God intended. Ishmael is not the promised son. God has yet to fulfill this promise. So he reminds Abraham that I made a covenant with you, that I promised you that you were going to have descendants. That's where this is going. And it's interesting that God doesn't put the explanation up front and say, this is what this is. You know, here's my covenant with you, and here's the sign that shows your obedience to it. God puts these things first and then tells him what the covenant really is. Why do you think God would reverse that? Tell him, that I'm going to establish my covenant with you. Here's what it's going to take to prove your obedience to the covenant. But by the way, I haven't told you what this covenant is yet. Why would God present it that way?
Trust.
There you go. Faith. God expects Abraham to simply trust him. So he doesn't give him the details yet. He wants to wait for Abraham's response and then tells him, okay, here's what this entails. Here's what my promise or my covenant is with you.
I got another question. When I said he didn't have an heir, I had forgotten that Ishmael had already been born.
Ishmael has been born by this point.
Does he consider Ishmael at this point to be his heir? To be the father of those who will be his descendants? Because he doesn't know that God's going to give him another son?
That's part of the problem, is Abraham is assuming that Ishmael is the heir. And Ishmael is not going to be the heir, and God steps in at this point to correct him. Which also should point out the fact that God's on a different timetable than we are. Because, well, actually fast forward to verse 25. In verse 25 it says, and Ishmael his son was 13 when he was circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin. It's been which not only 13, but of course you get 9 months of pregnancy. Essentially, Sarai had hatched this plot 14 years earlier. And how long had it been since God had promised him that till Sarai finally got impatient?
10 years.
Yeah. So we're talking 24 years have passed since God gave Abraham this promise. And Abraham's looking in the mirror and thinking, I'm getting old. Sarai's already too old. So how's this going to work out? So you're absolutely right. At this point, Abraham's thinking, well, Ishmael must be my heir and the son that this is all going to be accomplished by. And by the way, that's part of the problem today is Ishmael's descendants all assumed that that was what was meant. All right. But at this point, God tells him, here's the sign of the covenant. Now, the sign basically is saying that this is essentially their statement of faith that says, okay, we trust you, God. I'm going to enter into this covenant. And when you see what God told him to do, you got to figure that Abraham definitely had to trust God at this point. Because what Abraham's about to be asked to do, no man with any sanity at all would, agree to this. All right. Verse 12. And every male among you who is 8 days old, by the way, that is where, we're told that when Jesus was born, when did Mary take him to the temple? At the 8th day. To not only to be, for the rite of purification to offer the sacrifice, but for circumcision.
Moses got in trouble because he didn't have his.
Absolutely. God confronted Moses on the road out of Egypt that's when his wife got mad at him because, God sent his angel, said, kill them. They're outside the covenant. And that's why they had basically a circumcision ceremony right there on the spot.
That's a heck of a reason to have a party.
Yeah.
Jericho, you know.
Yeah, needless to say, Moses' wife wasn't happy with him, but it was Moses' fault.
You know, God could have solved this whole thing with Hagar by making Ishmael a girl.
See, Pastor running in the family.
Now I see why you two got married. All right, we're done. Okay. Every male among you who is 8 days old shall be circumcised throughout your generations. A servant who is born in the house, or who is bought with money from any foreigner, who is not of your descendants. Basically, God's telling him, everybody, not just Abraham, you and Ishmael, but everybody. A servant who is born in your house, or who is bought with your money, shall surely be circumcised. This shall be my covenant, or this shall be my covenant in your flesh for an everlasting covenant. Now, here God does use the term everlasting. But it's interesting that God refers to this here as an everlasting covenant, but Paul tells us later on that we're no longer under this. So where's the conflict here? How can this be an everlasting covenant if we're no longer required to do this? What has changed?
Now, isn't it just referencing the Jews? I mean, I realize you can say that there's spiritual Jews and there's physical Jews, but isn't this an everlasting covenant for Jews who are Jews?
For the physical Jews, not the spiritual Jews.
Not the Gentiles that took over.
You're half right. You're half right.
Which half?
Which half?
Oh, man. Yeah.
Think rather than thinking Jews, look at it from this perspective. And this, if you look at it from this perspective, would it also explain how God can call this an everlasting covenant, but yet it doesn't apply anymore? Like, how can something that be everlasting and not apply? This answers the question, and this answers your question. It's not just for the Jews, but for those who are under the law. Now, you may be thinking the law hasn't been given yet, but what is God doing by establishing this, even though the law hasn't yet been given?
Starting it.
He's laying the groundwork for it. He's laying the groundwork. And then this is fully realized under the law. Well, with the crucifixion and resurrection of Christ, what happened to the law?
Fulfilled.
It was fulfilled. Didn't go away. And that's why God can say this is everlasting. Because the law has not gone away. The law is still active. But it's, as Merrill just mentioned, it's been fulfilled. And you mentioned it earlier, we now have a new covenant. And one that, according to the Apostle Paul, supersedes this. So, if you are under the law, this covenant still applies. So how then do you get out from under this? You accept Christ. Because if you don't accept Christ, well then you are under this covenant, and if you want a relationship with God, you have to live according to the law. But then that brings up the next question. Who can live perfectly under the law?
Only
That's
Jesus.
pretty clear.
Only Jesus.
Paul makes that
Nobody
pretty
else.
clear. Paul makes that pretty clear in Romans.
So in essence, now I realize this is a theologically shady thing to say, but I'm going to throw it out here just to chew on for a minute. In essence, you could say that the Bible actually presents two paths to God. I won't say a plan of salvation because it doesn't really work that way, but two paths to God. Either grace through faith, which is salvation, or to live perfectly under the law. Because if you could live perfectly under the law, would you need salvation? No, you wouldn't. You would never have sinned. That's why I say it's not two plans of salvation, it's simply two paths to God. But who has ever or could ever live perfectly under the law? None of us, just Jesus. And Jesus didn't really need a path to God because
He is God.
He is God. So that was where this whole thing kind of turns back on itself, in that if you could live according to the law, you wouldn't need salvation and you would be under this eternal covenant, but none of us can do that. So therefore, God has given us a new covenant, and that's grace through faith. All right. And by the way, this whole issue of circumcision, Paul says that under the law of grace, we have a spiritual circumcision, and that applies to both men and women, which is what? Our heart's been changed. The whole point of this circumcision was to, rather graphically, I would think, to cut away the parts of your life that stood in the way, that were unclean. So that didn't do the job. It did not establish a relationship with God. Yes, it said that you were obeying the covenant, and that's why Paul said under grace, God has cut away those parts of our heart that stand between us and God. All right. Verse 14. But an uncircumcised male who is not circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin, that person shall be cut off from his people. He has broken my covenant.
All right, I got a serious question here.
All right.
Why would God choose a sign that everyone typically keeps hidden? I mean, I understand it's not hidden from God, but how would
you just answered your own
how
question.
would God's people know to cut somebody off if that sign is hidden from them?
Because who's doing the cutting off of the covenant? Not the people, God. Just like, you gave the perfect example earlier, Larry. You said that God sent his death angel to confront Moses on the way out of Egypt. The people didn't need to know, but God knew, and God confronted him because of it.
So the shall be cut off is not cut off by the people, it's cut off by God.
Cut off by God.
Okay, I misinterpreted that. Thank you.
Then God said to Abraham, now this is the renaming of her. As for Sarai your wife, you shall not call her name Sarai, but Sarah shall be her name. Now, anybody know the difference between Sarai and Sarah?
Couple letters.
I expected that from Larry.
Sorry, got in on your train there, Larry.
Sarai basically just meant royalty. The appointed one, so to speak. But Sarah meant princess. Because Sarah is now, she is the mother. As Abraham is now the father of kings, Sarah is now going to be the mother of them. So she is now the princess. That's what God has redone here, is given her a slightly nuanced name to indicate what her role will be. And I will bless her, and indeed I will give you a son by her. Then I will bless her, and she shall be a mother of nations. Kings of peoples shall come from her. This is the first time God tells Abraham point blank, it's not Hagar, it's not anybody else. It is going to be through your wife Sarah that you are going to have a son. Then Abraham fell on his face and laughed and said in his heart, will a man be born, or will a child be born to a man 100 years old? And will Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child? Now the question you got to ask is, when it says that he fell on his face and laughed, is he laughing because he thinks this is a ridiculous idea, or is he laughing because he's thinking, what a thing to do for me, Lord?
You got to be kidding.
So it all depends on why he laughed, as to, is this a fulfillment of Abraham's faith, that he's laughing because he's thinking, this is great, Lord, or is he saying, Lord, you're crazy?
Does 18 clarify what he means?
Well, maybe. It's possible. Verse 18 says, and Abraham said to God, oh, that Ishmael might live before thee. In other words, what Abraham is saying, you know, my son Ishmael, bless him. Let him be the one. Because, of course, we know from the end of the chapter here, Ishmael is now 13 years old. Which tells you that if Abraham has spent the last 13 years raising this boy, do you think he's just the slave girl's boy? Or do you think Abraham might have actually developed some serious fatherly feelings for this boy? Abraham wants God to bless him. Said, okay, yeah, it's great that you're going to give me another son, but I've got Ishmael here. He's my son. Don't forget about him. So now, to tell you the truth, whether Abraham is laughing because he's thinking, this is great, you're going to give Sarah, a 90-year-old woman, a son, or whether he's thinking, Lord, you're crazy, it's really kind of hard to say at this point.
Do you think that his relationship was like Esau, Jacob? I mean, he basically, that was his favorite son, really. It took,
Maybe.
Yeah, I really wonder.
It was his only son. He had to.
Yeah, I know, but I mean,
At this point.
At this point, yeah.
But now, if he does indeed have faith in God, which we know the Bible tells us he did, so even if he laughed thinking about this, in his mind he knows if God says this is going to happen, I have no doubt Abraham believed, yep, this is going to happen, just the way you said it. But Abraham's still a sinner, just like the rest of us, so he may have had some mixed feelings in this. But anyway, verse 19, he says, but God said, no, but Sarah, your wife, shall bear you a son, and you shall call his name Isaac, which, by the way, means he laughed. So God's got a sense of humor too, that he tells him to name the son that I'm going to give you. Essentially, you laughed, now you're going to name your son. He laughed. And I will establish my covenant with him for an everlasting covenant for his descendants after him. And as for Ishmael, I have heard you. Now, by the way, this is another little, twist on the language. It says, as for Ishmael, I have heard you. What did Ishmael's name mean? God hears.
Yeah, God hears.
Because remember when Hagar cried out to God, God answered her. God told her, you're going to have a son. You're going to call him Ishmael, because the name Ishmael means the God who hears. So he says, as for Ishmael, as for your son who is called the God who hears, well, I heard you. I will bless him and will make him fruitful and will multiply him exceedingly. He shall become the father of 12 princes, and I will make him a great nation. Now notice there, both Ishmael and Isaac gave rise to 12 tribes. Ishmael, he's got 12 princes who will descend from him. Isaac, in the next generation, with Jacob and Esau, through Jacob, mind you, gives rise to 12. As far as we know, Esau, the nations that descended from him, we don't know exactly, at least I can't say that I recall off the top of my head exactly how many he had. But there was a whole bunch of descendants at this point in the second and third generation. But my covenant I will establish with Isaac, whom Sarah will bear to you at this season next year. So, God essentially told him, 1 year from now, you're going to have another son. And it's going to be through Sarah. And when he had finished talking with him, God went up from Abraham. Now, what does this in verse 22 tell us? What? And by the way, there's this word theodicy.
It wasn't a vision or a dream. God was there, present with him.
Yeah. Now, I'm going to throw out a little vocabulary word for you, in case you run across this in any commentaries or your study literature, your study Bibles. A theodicy is an encounter with God. Now, Abraham, at this moment, is having a theodicy. God is there literally speaking to him. And the fact that it says now in verse 22 that God went up from him, which person of the Godhead do you think he was talking to?
Jesus.
Jesus. Verse 23, then Abraham took Ishmael his son, and all the servants who were born in his house, and all who were bought with his money, every male among the men of Abraham's household. That's a lot of slaves and a lot of servants. Which also, by the way, it says, and circumcised the flesh of their foreskin in the very same day as God had said to him. Two things that tells us. Number one is Abraham was a man of faith, that he acted what God told him to do. He dealt with it that day. The second thing is you call your servant men in and say, by the way, I got something we're going to do. What does this tell you about Abraham's authority?
Absolute command.
Absolutely. Because no man is going to, let's say if you were in the army
We're
today.
going to do what?
And your commander called you in and said, okay, men, follow me. And they look at you and go, you're going to do what? No, we're not. The fact that they were willingly submitted to this tells us, again, as Merrill just mentioned, Abraham's authority in his household was absolute. They didn't question this. Now, by the way, I read a commentator, who I think is wrong, by the way, that said that in all probability, Abraham kind of did this to himself first, and then followed up with Ishmael and then all the men. I don't think so. I think if all probability, Abraham probably did himself last, or had one of his servants take care of it. Because as an adult, you can circumcise a baby, and in fact, I've read multiple accounts that says that at that age, most baby boys barely feel it. But for an adult male, you're going to be in some serious pain for several days afterward. If Abraham circumcised every man in his entourage and his 13-year-old son, I can almost guarantee you he did not circumcise himself first, because he would have been too sore. Actually, later on, there's another biblical account of this, why we know that wouldn't have happened. Do you recall when in the tribe, the sons of Jacob, that
The sister got raped.
the sister got raped, and Reuben and Simeon, I believe, were the ones that went into this other tribe and told them that, well, you can have our sister, as a wife on one condition. Because we're worshipers of Yahweh, and this is what's required of us, if you want to marry into our family, this is what you have to do. And they all agreed to it, and we're told that they were then afterwards so sore that Reuben and Simeon and their servants were able to go in that night and slaughter every single one of them. They were too sore to fight back. If that's the case, I can almost guarantee you the likelihood that Abraham went first, I think Abraham went last. just a
So he
thought.
had the strength to oversee it and make sure it was done.
Absolutely. Otherwise, he'd have been sitting in his tent moaning for a couple of days. All right. Verse 24. Now Abraham was 99 years old when he was circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin. Ishmael, his son, was 13 years old when he was circumcised, flesh of his foreskin. In the very same day, Abraham was circumcised, and Ishmael, his son, and all the men of his household who were born in the house or bought with money from a foreigner were circumcised with him. Well, I think there's a couple of lessons on faith in this. Number one, the fact that God said, this is what you need to do. Abraham was willing immediately to follow through on that day. The other thing, just like the story I told you about what Reuben and Simeon did, if they did this with every single male in the household,
The work
If-
would stop.
what's that?
The work would have stopped on
The
ranch.
work would have stopped, but worse yet, if Abraham had enemies around them that knew or found out, hey, these guys are going to be incapacitated for the next 3 or 4 days, what do you think they would have probably done?
Attacked.
They'd have attacked and taken everything he had. The fact that he was willing to be obedient in 100% and not say, well, we're going to do this half today, we'll wait 3 or 4 days and then we'll do the other half. Says he was obedient to what God told him to do 100% of every one of them in the household, which tells us right there, Abraham trusted God enough to know that he figured nothing is going to happen, we will not be attacked, nobody's going to find out because God's going to protect us. That in itself tells us Abraham trusted God.
That was Dinah that got raped.
Yeah. Well, I didn't go into too terribly much detail because that's a Genesis story that we're going to get to here in a few weeks.
I take it all back.
Okay. Questions? Interesting lesson today.